We all had that one mate. Mine was called Simon. Everyone that I knew that had a home micro in the early to mid 1980s mainly had either a ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64. Anthony had a Amstrad CPC. Christian had a BBC Micro, which, even though he lived in a council house in Stevenage, made him dead posh in my ZX Spectrum owning group of friends. Then there was Simon. There was no fanfare about the computer he owned. In fact, I don't recall him ever mentioning it until I went round his house and saw it for my very own eyes and yelled, "What the hell is that?" The Metoy toy company wanted to be part of the growing home computer boom that was taking place in the early 80s. This is essentially how their spin-off company, called Dragon Data Limited, based in Swansea, started life, and by August 1982 they successfully brought to market their very own home microcomputer. The Dragon 32 was priced competitively to match the rivals on offer at around £200. It was based on the same Motorola MC6883 design as the Tandy TRS-80 color computer, also known as the Coco, a more successful home computer in the US, which was released some 2 years prior here in the UK. Not ever really considered a true clone of the Tandy, but with enough similarities that a majority of Tandy software could be made compatible with minor adjustments, with both computers using the same Motorola 6809 CPU clocked at the same speeds. The 32, if not obvious by now, stood for the 32K on offer here. A 64K model was introduced in 1984, but wasn't as successful due to a lack of software that really took advantage of the extra RAM, and more than likely more so, the memory management issues that meant that when you did try and utilize the 64K on offer, it disabled the disk cartridges, meaning you couldn't use any floppy drives, which was a slight issue. Dragon 32 owners could upgrade their units to 64K if they really wanted to though. With its rather lacking colour palette and considered graphical capabilities compared to the other successful home computers at the time, many software houses had to make a decision. Write games for the Zilog Z80 or MOS Technology 6502 processors used by its main competitors and make room for the Motorola MC6809E that Dragon used, or ditch it altogether. Most, more on that later, chose to ditch, so the software library became smaller and smaller. Dragon Data were convinced sales would continue and subsequently overstocked themselves, which ultimately led to them going into receivership in 1984, with Spanish company Eurohard taking over the business and eventually moving production to Spain before they finally went under in 1987. So if it was considered graphically inferior to its competitors, it was probably late to the party, it hardly had any games, hardly any of your mates had one, and it was unlikely to have a successor, and it wasn't even made in the UK anymore, who on earth was buying one? And more importantly, why? Well, I don't know about Simon and his Dragon 32 owning story, but this Dragon 32 here used to belong to a chap called Chris. Chris was very much one of those Dragon owning kids, but even he was not happy with his Dragon computer come Christmas 1984. Rewind to that Christmas, an 11-year-old Chris desperately wanted a computer, but was also well aware of the budget constraints put on his Christmas list. Growing up in a council house with 4 other siblings meant that he had to be careful with his choices. Looking at the Christmas 1984 Argos catalogue here gives you an idea of the choices available and at what price. A 16K Atari 600 XL at 160 quid, a Sinclair ZX Spectrum at 130, or a Commodore 64 at 199, which didn't come with the 45 quid's worth cassette drive, which you would have most definitely needed. Even an Atari 2600 cut-down version was 70 quid, so Chris had to think about what to go for. In fairness, his parents knew the benefits of a home computer and what it could bring, and were even suggesting a Commodore 64 was on the table. But Chris wasn't interested in that because he wanted the Dragon. Was he mad? Would he regret his choices? Well, actually, no. Firstly, he had a couple of kids he knew who had one. He really liked the look of it, a similar size to the BBC Micro, which was in all the schools, with a keyboard to match. It felt a better option than, say, the rubber-keyed nastiness of the Sinclair Spectrum at the time. Plus, he knew he had someone he could definitely swap games with. Then there was the price. Yes, a year earlier you could argue against it, as Boots the Chemist, who were one of the major Dragon 32 stockists at the time, had it at £175, seen here in the Christmas 1983 catalogue. Fast forward a year though, and with the struggles to get overstocked units sold in a really competitive market, it was now a mere £79, just a tenner more than the cut-down 2600. He knew this was a more viable price point for his parents. His sister worked at the No. 7 Boots perfume counter also in the local Bridge End store, so an even more discounted price might be on the cards. And finally, Chris was also really aware of the Dragon Computers being a proper local entity. His dad worked as a foreman at Borg Warner on the Kenfig Industrial Estate Margam, which is where the original Swansea-based Dragon Data company relocated to. His dad worked next door to them. Surely it was just meant to be. So Christmas morning finally arrived and Santa delivered the goods. Chris was full of excitement as he set it all up. On the surface everything seemed fine until he tried to load a game. Nothing happened. He tried and tried again, different cassettes, plugging things in and out again, still no joy. There was clearly an issue with the audio input which wasn't picking up anything from the cassette player. What was worse for Chris back then though was that the shops wouldn't reopen until the 27th. None of this Boxing Day opening malarkey. So after 2 days of no game playing for Chris, the agonising wait was finally over and off they went to the Bridge End branch of Boots with the 40 Dragon all boxed up. There was a super long queue of people returning unwanted gifts or spending Christmas money on something from the bargain bins dotted around the store as sales had started. One such bargain bin Chris noticed whilst queuing was full of computer games, £1.99 each or 3 for £5. To Chris's amazement, they were all Dragon games from Microdeal, Shard, Salamander, Peaksoft, you name it, it was in there. Chris managed to convince his parents to get 3 for a £5, which would make up the first games he had purchased for his currently broken Dragon. The games were Cuthbert in Space, Mr. Dig, shown here, and Mystery for the Java Star, selected by his mum as it was a more educational title. So, 45 minutes after frantically searching around the stockroom to find a replacement machine, Chris had waited so long that they even threw in a free Hungry Horace game, Amplesoft's basic tutorial, and a free book, The Working Dragon 32. On top of the 3-game Boots Microdeal pack the Dragon came with, he now had all these extra bits plus the games from the bargain bin. What a result! Maybe it being broken was not a bad turn of events after all. They finally got home and it all worked first time, and now he had a fair few games to choose from. Ultimate Adventure 4 was the adventure game included, a rather simple text adventure affair which was completed by New Year's. Flipper was an Othello-inspired game that Chris played a lot with his dad in these early days, but the first game he actually picked up and played was this, Caterpillar Attack, which was one of the packing games. An early Centipede clone, which was fairly primitive in appearance, but was certainly a game he played to death during that Christmas break. Caterpillar Attack was one of the many Dragon titles by a Cornish company that even if you knew very little about Dragon games and their publishing houses, you might remember with their logo with a nerdy looking kid resting on top of the company name Microdeal. Starting out with selling mail order Tandy games, when the Dragon 32 took off, it was a natural fit for John Symes to concentrate his efforts on Dragon software instead of other more popular systems. The business grew very quickly, so he came up with a very clever marketing plan. In a similar style to software houses like US Gold, they took games that had launched stateside for the aforementioned TRS-80 and outsourced these to get converted rather easily to the very similar Dragon. They kept names of some of these games, typos included, Caterpillar Attack being one of them, but they did change up others, including games that they could attribute to their nerdy Mad magazine character-inspired mascot called Cuthbert, who even went on to have his own magazine of sorts called the Cuthbert Chronicle. Just look at these kids in a lookalike competition in said magazine. With this new mascot, they launched a series of successful arcade clones based around Cuthbert's adventures, some written by in-house programmers and some ported from elsewhere. There were some Cuthbert games that didn't make an appearance on the Dragon, but those that did included Cuthbert Goes Digging, I Said Digging, a rather limited looking but highly playable Space Panic clone that made it onto the TRS-80 also. Cuthbert Goes Walkabout, based on the Konami arcade game Amadar, originally for the TRS-80 and Dragon 32, but then also ported to the Atari 8-bits and Commodore 64. Cuthbert in the Jungle, which was a blatant Pitfall ripoff, which was probably a bit too good a Pitfall clone not to go unnoticed, even if it was renamed from Trapfall from the TRS-80 version. It eventually had to be withdrawn in fear of being sued. Cuthbert in the Mines, a little more original title this one, and that is a nod to Frogger but also reminded me of Jumpin' Jack on steroids. Good fun this one, extremely addictive. Cuthbert and the Golden Chalice, which is in the same vein as Hunchback, moving left to right, avoiding obstacles along the way, and one of the later titles for the Tandy and Dragon 32 only. Cuthbert in the Cooler finds our hero in a Second World War prison camp somehow, which is effectively a fairly simple maze game. And finally the game Chris picked from that bargain bin, Cuthbert in Space, often compared to Joust, probably only an appearance really, and closer to Jetpack. It's a game of platforms and collecting fuel for your spacecraft so you can visit the next world along. Again, fairly simple but quite challenging too. Cuthbert even appeared on the cover art of other games that he didn't actually appear in, such was the desire to get him shoehorned in everywhere. Microdeal were it for Dragon users, the standout publisher who rarely got things wrong here. Not so highly regarded elsewhere, but if you owned a Dragon and found a new Microdeal game out in the wild, you were almost certainly picking it up. They had a club you could join by sending off the card that came with games to get your Cuthbert badge. They had a budget range called Pocket Money Games, one of which was a game called Pit Fiend, which was Simon Francis's game that got his foot in the door at Jarrell, who later went on to make the wonderful Critical Mass. They even owned their own tape duplication setup called Top Copy and produced their own Cuthbert blank cassettes no less. Other big software houses did put out a few games for the Dragon initially, but as sales dwindled, most concentrated their efforts elsewhere. Ocean, for example, just had Hunchback here. Imagine had 5 titles: Arcadia, BC Bill, Cosmic Cruiser, Leggett and Pedro, Leggett being the Dragon version of Jumpin' Jack mentioned earlier. Hewson Consultants 3D Lunar Attack here, showing off the Dragon's high-res output that, although only had 4 colours, gave a more detailed, sharper image compared to the often green and more blocky low-res games that did support a wider palette. For Chris, green was very much the colour of the day from the odd time he played games on the big TV in the house, as his TV here was just for his Dragon and was black and white, and quite possibly had the best name for any TV at any point in history. To get round the black and white issue, he got hold of some green acetate and stuck it over the screen, instantly giving him that green colour in games. Genius. So with Boots getting rid of stock dead cheap and 2 friends to swap games with, Chris's game library started to grow. There was also another avenue for game ownership with a small computer shop that was located upstairs through this door initially, called the Bridge End Computer Centre, which was co-owned alongside a video store brilliantly called the Dukes of Hazzard. They still stocked Dragon games, which was great, but what was even better is that they allowed members to rent them out for £1 a night. Now, I can only imagine what abuse me and my friends would throw at this offer, and Chris was no exception, renting the games and then backing them up. Obviously, he didn't want to wear the shop's tapes out. How thoughtful. So with this rental agreement available to him, any new games were instantly gettable for just £1, and his library was looking even more impressive. On occasion, a rental would be shared with friends who also owned a Dragon, and on one such rental, Jet Set Willy was due to be returned, but was still at another kid's house who was reluctant to give it back. Chris had to stump up another night's rental money and persisted in getting the game back, which soured the relationship he had with one of the 2 kids he knew he could trade with. Upon returning the overdue game, he checked the contents to find the colour-coded anti-piracy sheet had been cut out and replaced with a photocopied one that was pretty much unusable. The kid was a bit of a bully and Chris didn't want to confront him, so he took it back to the shop, posted it through the door and legged it, terrified of the consequences. He got on well with the owners, so felt terrible, and it was one of those childhood experiences that can sit with you for years. So with tape-to-tape copying and computer shops seemingly encouraging piracy, and some publishers trying to stop copying with code sheets as in Jet Set Willy, others went for an even more extreme methods, with Microdeal's Buzzard Bait here, which is a Joust clone that required you to insert a dongle into your joystick port in order to load it up. Funnily enough, Microdeal had a competition set in their own magazine, the Cuthbert Chronicle, to see if anyone could defeat the mighty dongle. Prior to the challenge, a programmer called Roy Coates, who was responsible for the Dragon 32 versions of Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy, had sent off a game called Rebellion to Microdeal, thinking they would be interested, only for it to be rejected. For a little fun revenge, he entered the competition to see if he could break their copy protection. He did just that. He received this award for his endeavours, but was mainly chuffed that he'd managed to get a little payback on his game rejection. Funnily enough, Chris now knows Roy through the Dragon community, and as a gift, mocked up this Rebellion game to show what it would have looked like if Microdeal had released it. Roy was overjoyed at this, which was a fun little thing to do. Although there were many software publishers for the Dragon, by 1986-87, new games were drying up fast as kids looked elsewhere for their gaming. Even Microdeal were just releasing 4 or 5 games around this period. Dragon User magazine was the only lifeline really, with the bargain games from Micromail in the adverts selling off old stock. Prices were crazy, with it being easy to get 10 games for as little as £7.50 plus postage and packaging. Or the Computerware X Dragon Data re-releases for 99p each just for the cassette and no inlays. Nowhere in Bridgend was selling software anymore at that point, not even the Bridgend Computer Centre, so finding any in the wild was pretty much finished. So by late 1987, and by a stroke of luck really, Chris had seen some good games on a friend's Spectrum 48K, like Spy Hunter, Great Escape, etc., and thought all Spectrum games were that good. So one random Saturday in the computer centre, he just asked how much he could trade in his Dragon 32 for something else. They would sell him a well-used second-hand 48K rubber-keyed Specky for Chris's Dragon plus an extra tenner, which he decided was a good deal. Also the same day he rented some games, as he was still a member. The games were Whizball and Renegade, which is not a bad start to Specky ownership by any account. He did really like the Spectrum, however as the months went on he quickly discovered that there were a lot of crap games in amongst the good ones. The best ones were really superb, but he found a lot just unplayable, and he never managed to invest as much time into it as he did for the Dragon for some reason. It just didn't hit the same for him. It wasn't until he owned an Amiga that he got that buzz again, as he started using it for music production. The Amiga served him well, but at around 1994 he discovered car boot sales, and he spotted a Dragon 32 cheap as chips, and he knew he had to get one again. It was the first thing he reacquired from those teenage days of gaming, and ever since he's always had 1 or 2 knocking about, with so many happy memories associated with growing up with a Dragon. Playing games like Dragon Data's Starlag as a kid with his mum and dad, working together and completing 99% of it as a family, and there were so many irreplaceable happy memories associated with it. There is no denying that nostalgia plays a large part in the games and systems you revisit now. I show my kids some simple Spectrum games and it piques their interest for a short while, but they would always prefer to be playing Roblox or Minecraft. But it's nice to show them where this gaming journey started for me, all those years ago. I certainly don't have nostalgia for the Dragon 32 and its games, but that one memory of going to Simon's house really stuck with me. I can't remember the game we played, but I do remember it being a shooter of some description, and it was also very green, and I thought it looked primitive compared to my Spectrum graphics at the time. And that was that. That was my perception of the Dragon 32 for years to come. But through this hobby, I wanted to learn more about systems I probably misremembered, and the Dragon certainly fits that bill. The Dragon library did become dated as the more popular 8-bit computer games went through iterations of improvements as programmers learned all the tricks to squeeze everything out of them, eventually turning the heads of any passionate Dragon users. As mentioned before, Chris must have seen The Great Escape, for example, and thought, I want that game. So much so that he was willing to trade in his beloved computer for something old and second-hand just to play some of those titles. In those very early days though, those Dragon games really held their own. I truly believe it could quite easily have been a different story if Dragon Data established their computer at around the same time the TRS-80 released here in the UK in around April in 1980. Imagine some of these games 2 years prior to the launch of the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. If the price point was kept low enough and enough people purchased them as leading the pack, software companies might have invested more time writing for them, and therefore the 64K model might have succeeded earlier and with some improvements really taken control of the 8-bit UK market. Games like Airball really show what it was really capable of. Unless you played the Dragon back in the day, were you aware of what it could do? How fantastic does this look? And how quickly does it flick between screens? Chucky Egg on the Dragon is probably only bettered by the BBC Micro version. With its easily accessible ladders and control method, it certainly pushes for the #1 Chucky Egg spot. And it's worth noting the position of the cursor keys on the Dragon 32 as well. Laid out in a much more friendly QAOP layout, this machine was really game ready right out of the box. It did simple very well too. Backtrack here may be a simple maze game, but just look how fluid it is as you move through the rooms. Once again, lovely to play even now. Even basic written games looked good, like Flag here. Zaxxon may have been a Tandy game, but due to the systems being so close in design, it's fully playable on the Dragon and is probably the best 8-bit version in this high-res mode. Yes, it lacks colour, but plays and looks fantastic even today, as much as it did back then. Here's Brewmaster. A Tapper clone, anyone? Well, the Dragon had you covered. Or how about smooth scrolling maze arcade adventures? You could try Touchstone or Time Bandits. Caverns of Chaos is an interesting one, as the publisher Blabby made god-awful games elsewhere. Death Kick on the CPC, anyone? But they did make pretty good Dragon games, as seen here with this one. Interestingly, Blabby were bought up by a company called Preston Computer Games, who was another very local publisher based in Bridgend, not Preston, near where Chris lived. There weren't that many actual licensed arcade games for the Dragon, like Frogger here. Lots of clones existed, like Donkey King, which had to eventually remove the word donkey, as that was a step too far, and just ended up being called The King. Until the later Ocean license release though, this was undoubtedly the best 8-bit version around on the home computers. Same for Ice Castles, which was a Crystal Castles clone way before other 8-bits got a look in. This was originally called Crystal Castles, and it was hastily renamed, hence the big gap between words on the menu screen. Once again though, a fantastic, probably not bettered version on the 8-bits. And what about now? Like other systems that people still have nostalgia for, games are still being made. More so for the 64K edition, seen here with Death Chase in the fantastic X-Raw emulator that is freely available online. Just find some ROMs and away you go. Flappy Bird Dragon style, anyone? Or even maybe an unreleased Saberman game. And the computers themselves always appear on eBay, untested for less than 100 quid if you fancy a punt, and various prices bundled with different peripherals depending on how much of a chancer the seller is. Mine here uses a SCART connection to an old LCD TV and still uses the perfectly fine power supply unit. As for playing games on it now, I was lucky to be gifted this card from Chris with the very generous Dragon 32 bundle he shipped to me. A chap called, and I'm going to apologise before saying his name because no doubt I've got it completely wrong. Here we go. Sundy kjell has started pushing these cards out, which are a very affordable way of playing games instantly on your Dragon 32 in 2025. I'll put links in the description for anyone interested. That's it for this one, but I have to say a huge thank you to Chris for providing me with my very own Dragon 32 and all the lovely bits you sent with it. And also a huge thank you for making this video possible. I'll put some links in the description to places where you can find him on Facebook for all things Microdeal, music and beyond. In the meantime, I'm off to play me some of this Welsh wonder. So as always, thanks for watching and hopefully I'll see you all on the next one. Bye for now.